But I want to emphasize the very, very positive opportunity that lies from climate action. And that is the starting point of the report that we launched, day before yesterday, which I co-chaired with Professor Nick Stern and Vera Songwei, who also was a co-chair of the Task Force Klima report. So if you look at these reports, a very powerful message is at this point in time, the world needs a very big push on investment. It needs a big push of investment because of the macroeconomic situation we find ourselves, because investment had been declining, for several years, and especially amplified by the COVID crisis. And if you look at Latin America and you look at Africa, the level of investment right now is such that you cannot get an iota of growth because there's no capital deepening happening in those two parts of the world. So it's extremely important to think about investment as something necessary just for growth. Second, you think about investment, and you have to look at it from the perspective of development and the sustainable development goals. So when we talk about a gap, actually we're falling behind on the SDGs and we need a big push. But in the climate area, the needs are not only large, but they are urgent. That's what distinguishes climate from other areas. We do not have the time to wait. And so investing at this point in time is critical, but there is also behind it huge opportunity. And I want to stress it. The first is in the clean energy transition. The clean energy transition, our numbers say, emerging markets and developing countries other than China need to invest about 1.6 trillion. As was mentioned by Professor Ghasemli, at the moment, emerging markets and developing countries are behind. But when you look to the next 10 years, 60% of the clean energy investment increase will be in emerging markets and developing countries other than China. That is an investment opportunity. And you know what is fundamental about that investment opportunity? The power of the sun. If you look at Africa, it has about 50 to 60% of the best solar potential of the world. It has 2% of the investment. If you close that gap for Africa, if you close it for Asia, if you close it for Latin America, the power of cheap, clean energy to drive transformation is huge. And the technologies are now there. There are geopolitical issues to be tackled, particularly between China and Europe, China and the United States, because the source of a lot of that technology that is least cost, the plentiful availability of it is with China. Okay? So we have to find cooperative models around this transformation. Second, again, as Professor Ghasemli said, there's tremendous opportunity of avoided costs in adaptation. Every dollar you invest in adaptation, you save $4 to $10. So, it's not just a question of a gap, it's actually what you will avoid by way of cost that's extreme. And the third part, and of course that together with that comes loss and damage, but the third part of this, which is extremely important, is nature. The world is depleting nature and biodiversity at a much faster pace. Agriculture everywhere in the world is under threat. We have to invest. But the payoff from that investment, again, economists will attest, produce huge returns. So we have calculated in this new report how much would we save if we actually made the successful transformation. If we went from a rather imperfect, dirty, unproductive world to this new world, how much would the world save? And the numbers are astounding. They're somewhere between 15 to 20, 25% of GDP. And I can go through, they're both in the form of avoided cost, but in a world where you're not wasting so much money on things you don't need to consume, where you don't have to spend on fossil fuel subsidies, etc., actually you generate huge savings. So the question, and I'll stop here right now, is to say, how do you then tap this opportunity? How do you tap it? And the way you tap it is ensure that these least cost, best technologies are actually available, that countries have the capabilities to make the investment, as you said, that we are able to tackle the issues of debt and fiscal space that is limiting investment right now, and that we are able to mobilize all the pools of finance in the most effective way. And by all the pools of finance, I start with domestic resources, because ultimately nobody will be able to make the transformation unless we have strong domestic resources, both public and private. Second, as Nicola said, we have to unleash the potential of the multilateral development banks. And I was also a member of the other group that you said, and the numbers, by the way, are exactly the same because they came from me. So I can assure you the numbers are exactly the same. But let me say something about the MDBs. Day before yesterday, the MDBs announced a target. They said they will provide 120 billion in terms of climate finance. In our view, that is half of what they need to provide. But they didn't say this is what we will provide. They said this is what we will provide in a business as usual scenario. And of course, what does that mean? That means we cannot provide that money unless our shareholders support us. That's what they were saying. But to go to the 250 billion, we think is feasible. The last point, I want to just make two quick points. And so I think the private sector now is absolutely crucial. Why? Because the nature of investment has changed. In the energy transition, most of the investment will be the private sector, not the public sector. So private finance can play a very big role. Even in adaptation and resilience, even in nature, private sector can play a role. And we say that we can get 500 billion in domestic private finance, another 500 billion in external finance. But the biggest gap on finance is actually with private finance. We have to increase private finance 15 to 18 times to get the kinds of numbers. Even if we did it, it would be a very small proportion of global finance. But just to do that is a big lift. And the last thing I want to say, and this is where the NCQG right now is, we need credible commitments by the rich countries towards the NCQG. Okay? If they don't come up and provide, it's not such a big number, but it is about trust. Because at the moment, if you don't make that commitment, there will not be the trust. And yes, particularly because of what Professor Ghasimli said, adaptation is the big issue. And where will the money come from adaptation? At the moment, it's not coming from anywhere. It's not coming from domestic finance, it's not coming from the rich countries, and it's not coming from the multilateral development banks. Multilateral development banks can provide really long-term finance for adaptation. Adaptation has very good returns. It just takes a long time to realize it. So we need a really big push on adaptation. So in the NCQG, and I'm happy to go into the details of it if anybody is interested, but it's actually the solutions are staring us in the face. So let me end with a very positive note. The world has been in search of tipping points. The tipping point of low-cost energy, of resilience, is staring us in the face. And it is only up to us to seize it at this moment, tackling the impediments that hold back investment, and tackling finance and bringing down the cost of capital.